The August heat in Riverside, California pressed down on the earth like a punishment no one had earned. It rose from the asphalt in trembling columns, bending the air above the blacktop into shimmering curtains that made the row of Harley-Davidsons parked outside the Iron Reaper's clubhouse look like they were breathing. Slow, patient breaths. The kind of breathing that belongs to large animals, resting in the shade, waiting for a reason to move. It was a Saturday afternoon and Magnolia Avenue was doing what it always did on weekends, pretending to be quieter than it was. The liquor store across the street had its door propped open with a cinder block. The bus stop on the corner held a woman in scrubs who stared at her phone the way people stare at things when they're trying not to see what is actually around them. Two streets over, a dog barked at nothing, stopped and barked again, as if it had forgotten what it was upset about, but didn't want to waste the effort. The clubhouse sat behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, its cinder block walls carrying faded insignia from decades of paint and sun and Southern California wind. The building had no windows facing the street. That was intentional. The Iron Reapers, a Hells Angels charter that had held its territory in this part of Riverside for nearly 30 years, did not believe in transparency. The fence, the wire, the blank walls. These were statements, and the statement was simple. What happens on this side is none of your business. Garrett Braddock stood beside his motorcycle, a 2003 Road King with a cracked leather seat he had never bothered to replace, because the crack had formed itself around the shape of his body over 20 years, and replacing it would have felt like shaking hands with a stranger. He was wiping his hands on a rag that was already blacker than the oil it was supposed to absorb, and he was thinking about nothing in particular, which was his preferred state of mind. He was 44 years old, 6'3", 230 pounds of muscle that had only recently begun its long negotiation with gravity. His beard reached the second button of his riding vest, a dark, dense thing that looked like it had been grown not for style, but for armor. His forearms were sleeved in ink skulls with hollow eyes, pistons frozen mid-stroke, a clock face with no hands, and on the inside of his left forearm, in script that was smaller and more careful than everything else, a single name. Nola. He never talked about it. No one asked. Around the clubhouse, they called him Stone. Not because he was solid, though he was, because his face never moved. Not when he was angry, not when he was grieving, not when someone owed the club money and Stone was the one sent to collect it. His expression was the same whether he was watching a sunset or watching a man realize he had made a very serious mistake. It was a face that had been emptied of performance. Whatever Garrett Braddock felt, he felt it somewhere so deep that it never reached the surface. In 22 years with the Iron Reapers, he had held every role from prospect to sergeant-at-arms, and he had settled into a quiet authority that didn't require a title or a raised voice. He spoke rarely at meetings. When he did, the room listened. When he didn't, the room listened harder because silence from Stone meant he was thinking, and when Stone was thinking, it was wise to wait for the conclusion. He had no wife, no children, no pets. His two-bedroom bungalow in the Arlington Heights neighborhood contained a bed, a television he rarely watched, a kitchen he rarely used, and a garage full of motorcycle parts organized with the precision of a man who understood machines far better than he understood people. He had lived alone for 15 years, and he had made peace with it the way people make peace with weather. You don't argue with it, you just dress accordingly. He was checking the tension on his drive belt when the voice appeared. "Excuse me." It was thin, the kind of thin that voices get when they have been used mostly for crying and not much for talking. Garrett didn't look up right away. He assumed it was a neighbor with a noise complaint, or maybe one of those kids selling candy bars for a school fundraiser who had picked the worst possible storefront in the city of Riverside. "Excuse me, sir." He looked up. She was standing about 6 feet away, just on the other side of his front tire, and she was small enough that he had to adjust his gaze downward by a significant margin. She could not have been older than 7. Her hair was a tangle of light brown that hadn't seen a proper brush in days, maybe longer. She wore a pink t-shirt with a stain on the collar that might have been ketchup or might have been something older and harder to explain. Her denim shorts were too big, cinched at the waist with what appeared to be a shoelace tied in a knot. Her sneakers had once been white. One of them had no laces at all. She was holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear. The rabbit had seen better decades. Its fur was matted, one eye was missing, and its remaining ear, the one not being gripped, hung at an angle that suggested a long history of being dragged across floors and dropped from heights. It was the kind of toy that a child keeps not because it is beautiful, but because it is the one thing that has never left. Garrett stared at her. She stared back. There was no fear in her eyes, which was remarkable because most grown men found reasons to look somewhere else when Garrett Braddock turned his full attention on them. Contractors, bartenders, even other club members. They shifted their weight, cleared their throats, suddenly remembered something fascinating about their shoes. This girl looked at him the way someone looks at a vending machine, with a specific need and the quiet hope that the right button existed. "You lost?" Garrett asked. His voice was a low rumble that sounded like a diesel engine idling in a cathedral. The girl shook her head, Amanda. Then she tilted it slightly, the way a bird does when it's evaluating whether something is food or danger. And she asked the question that would divide Garrett Braddock's life into everything that came before and everything that came after. "Do you know anyone who wants a daughter?" Garrett's hand stopped moving on the rag. Behind him, leaning against the chain-link fence in the narrow strip of shade, it provided two club members were sharing a cigarette. One of them was Hank Dunlap, who had been Garrett's closest friend in the club for nearly 16 years. Hank was 51, wiry, sunburned, with a laugh like a broken muffler and a talent for saying exactly the wrong thing at exactly the right time. He let out a low whistle. "Kid," Hank said, grinning through his cigarette smoke, "you're asking the wrong guy. Stone here doesn't even want a houseplant." The girl didn't look at Hank. She kept her eyes on Garrett, and something in that gaze, something patient, something ancient, something entirely too heavy for a face that still carried baby fat, made Garrett set the rag down on the cracked leather seat of his Road King. "Where's your mom?" he asked. "Don't have one." "Your dad? Don't have one of those either." "Who's watching you?" The girl looked over her shoulder at the empty sidewalk, the liquor store with its propped open door, the bus stop where the woman in scrubs was still staring at her phone. She surveyed the landscape of adults the way a castaway surveys the horizon methodically without expectation. Then she looked back at Garrett. "Nobody," she said. The word didn't carry self-pity. It didn't tremble. It didn't ask for sympathy. It carried the matter-of-fact weight of someone stating the temperature. 87 degrees. Nobody. The sky is blue. These were just facts about the world she lived in. Garrett looked at Hank. Hank wasn't grinning anymore. Her name was Wren. She offered it the way you offer a ticket at a movie theater, like it was the one thing she had that might grant her entry somewhere. She didn't know her last name, or if she did, she had decided it wasn't worth sharing. She said she was 7, but her teeth suggested she might be 6. She was hungry. That much was obvious from the way her eyes tracked the bag of beef jerky sitting on the wooden picnic table outside the clubhouse, and Garrett handed it to her without a word. She ate like someone who had learned that food could be taken away at any moment. Quickly, quietly, with her body curved protectively over the bag, her shoulders drawn inward, her eyes moving even as her jaw worked. It was not the eating of a child. It was the eating of a creature that had been taught by repetition that nothing lasts. "Where did you come from?" Garrett asked, sitting on the bench across from her. He had sent Hank inside to get a bottle of water, and now the two of them were alone in the side yard, the sound of classic rock leaking through the clubhouse walls like a faded memory of someone else's good time. Wren chewed and thought about it. "The house with the blue door. Where's that?" "I don't know the street. It's near the place with the tacos." Garrett rubbed his jaw. That could describe half of Riverside. "Were you in a foster home?" Wren's face tightened. It was the first real emotion she had shown, a flash of something between anger and exhaustion that crossed her features the way a shadow passes over a field on a windy day quickly, but you notice it. "I was in 4, she said. 4 foster homes. Garrett let that number sit in the air between them like something with weight. 4 homes in 3 years, 4 front doors that opened with promises spoken or implied and then closed. 4 kitchens where she had eaten meals she didn't choose, slept in beds that weren't hers, learned the names of people who would become in a matter of weeks or months strangers again. 4 sets of adults who had looked at this girl who was sitting across from him right now, pulling jerky apart with fingers that were too small for the toughness of the meat, and decided for whatever reason that she was not worth the trouble of keeping. He didn't ask about the other 3 homes. He didn't need to. The details would be different, but the story would be the same. A placement that started with good intentions and ended with a phone call. A child who was too quiet or too loud, too clingy or too distant, too something that didn't fit the shape of the life that was already happening in that house before she arrived. The last one was the blue door. Wren continued, pulling a strip of jerky apart with her small fingers. Mrs. Hargrove, she has a lot of kids. She told me I was too much trouble. She paused. She said she was going to send me back, so I left before she could. You ran away. I walked away. Wren said it with a precision that suggested this distinction mattered to her. Running is for when someone chases you. Nobody chased me. Nobody chased me. Garrett felt something shift in his chest. Not his heart. Deeper than that. Something in the architecture of who he was, some wall that had been standing so long, he had forgotten it was a wall and not just part of the landscape. It didn't fall. It didn't crack. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, something pressed against it from the other side. Hank came back with the water and a look on his face that said he had been making phone calls. I called Jeannie at the bar, Hank said quietly, leaning in close. She knows a social worker over in San Bernardino, says we should call CPS and let them sort it out. CPS is what put her here, Garrett said. Brother, we can't just, she's a kid. Look around, we're not exactly a daycare. I know what we're not. Garrett looked at Wren. She had finished the jerky and was now carefully feeding invisible pieces to her stuffed rabbit, holding each imaginary morsel to the rabbit's stitched mouth with the focused seriousness of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. She made small chewing sounds on the rabbit's behalf. She whispered something to it that Garrett couldn't hear. He pulled out his phone and called the one person he trusted outside the club. Marge Kavanaugh was 61 years old, built like a fire hydrant, and ran a legal aid clinic on the second floor of a building downtown that smelled perpetually of old coffee and determination. She had a voice that could strip paint off a wall at 30 paces, and she owed Garrett a favor from a situation he did not discuss, and she did not forget. Garrett Braddock calling me on a Saturday, Marge said when she picked up. Someone must be dying. Nobody's dying. I need to know how the foster system works in Riverside County. There was a pause, the kind of pause that contains an entire conversation happening silently on the other end. Since when do you care about the foster system? Since about 20 minutes ago. Marge's tone shifted. She became precise, clinical. She explained the mechanics the way a mechanic explains an engine, not with passion, but with the exactness of someone who has taken the thing apart and put it back together enough times to know where every bolt goes and which ones are likely to fail. She explained how a child in foster care who runs away triggers a missing person report, how the foster parent is obligated to notify the agency immediately, how the agency then coordinates with law enforcement, how search parameters are established, how timelines are documented. She explained that if no report had been filed, it could mean one of two things. Either the foster parent hadn't noticed yet, or the foster parent didn't care enough to report it. If no one's looking for her, Garrett said slowly, what happens when she gets picked up? She goes back into the system, new placement, could be better, could be worse, could be a group home if they're short on families, which they always are. And if someone wanted to take her in, legally. Another pause, longer this time. Garrett could hear Marge breathing on the other end, could almost hear the calculations being made behind those sharp, relentless eyes. Garrett, are you asking me what I think you're asking me? I'm asking a hypothetical question. Hypothetically, Marge said, and the word carried the weight of a woman who had spent 30 years in the legal system and had no patience for hypotheticals. The person would need to be licensed as a foster parent, pass background checks, home inspections, complete training hours. Hypothetically, for a man with your record, that would be, she paused, challenging. Challenging or impossible. In my experience, Garrett, those are often the same word. The difference is just how stubborn the person is. Garrett hung up and sat very still for a moment. The sun had shifted and the shadow of the chain-link fence now fell across the side yard in a pattern that looked like graph paper. Wren was sitting on the bench with her hands folded in her lap, the rabbit tucked under one arm, watching him with an expression of total stillness. She wasn't begging, she wasn't performing, she wasn't making herself small or cute or pitiable. She was simply there, existing. taking up exactly the amount of space a 7-year-old girl takes up in the world, which is less than you'd think, and waiting to see if the world would make room for her or if she would need to keep walking. Garrett had seen a lot of things in 44 years. He had seen men lie. He had seen men fight. He had seen the inside of holding cells and the outside of hospital rooms and the long, empty stretches of highway that connect the parts of a life you don't talk about. But he had never seen anything as unflinching as this girl's patience. It was not the patience of someone who believed good things were coming. It was the patience of someone who had stopped believing that and kept going anyway. "You can stay here tonight," Garrett said. "We'll figure the rest out tomorrow." Wren nodded, not eagerly, not with relief, just a nod, an acknowledgement that this answer was acceptable and that tomorrow was a concept she would believe in when it arrived. Then she said very quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Thank you, Garrett." And something in the way she said his name carefully, like she was placing a glass figurine on a high shelf, made Hank Dunlap, who had been standing 6 feet away pretending to check his phone, turn his back entirely so that no one would see what was happening on his face. That night, Garrett brought Wren to his house. The bungalow on Emerson Street sat at the end of a row of similar houses, each one built in the 1950s, each one carrying the particular dignity of structures that were made to last but not to impress. Garrett's had a front porch. He never sat on a lawn, he rarely mowed, and a second bedroom that had served at various points over the past 15 years as storage for motorcycle parts, a place to pile laundry he intended to fold, in a room he simply didn't enter because there was no reason to. He opened the door and let Wren walk in first. She stood in the hallway and looked around with the careful assessment of someone evaluating not a home, but a possibility. Her eyes moved over the bare walls, the sparse furniture, the kitchen counter with its collection of takeout menus, and a coffee maker that was the only appliance that saw daily use. "It's quiet," Wren said. "Yeah, I like quiet." Garrett found a clean towel and showed her the bathroom. He found a t-shirt of his that she could sleep in. It hung to her knees and made her look like a ghost in a fabric store. He made the only thing he knew how to make that wasn't frozen, which was scrambled eggs, and she ate them at the kitchen table with a focus that told him everything he needed to know about how long it had been since her last real meal. He put her in the second bedroom on a mattress he had dragged from the hall closet and covered with the cleanest sheets he could find, which were not very clean, but were better than nothing. She arranged her rabbit on the pillow beside her and pulled the blanket up to her chin. "Garrett," she said when he reached the doorway. "Yeah. Can you leave the light on in the hallway?" "Sure. I don't like it when doors close all the way." He looked at her. In the light from the hallway, her face was very small and very old at the same time, the way faces get when they have learned too young that darkness is not just the absence of light, but the presence of things that happen when no one is watching. "I'll leave it open," Garrett said, "all the way." "Okay." He stood there for a moment longer, filling the door frame the way a man his size fills any frame, and then he went to the kitchen and sat at the table and listened to the house. For 15 years, the only sounds in this house had been his own. His footsteps, his breathing, the occasional creak of the bed frame when he turned in his sleep, the coffee maker in the morning. The television at night turned low more for noise than for content. 15 years of a house that sounded exactly like what it was, a place where one person lived and nobody visited. Now there was a different sound, small, barely there, but unmistakable. The sound of a child breathing in the next room, even and slow and trusting in the way that sleep breathing is trusting because you cannot control it, and the body when it sleeps tells the truth about whether it feels safe. Garrett sat at the table and listened to that breathing, and something that had been locked inside him for a very long time, something he had buried so deep that he had almost succeeded in forgetting it was there, began to press against its container. He knew what it was. He had known from the moment Wren had asked her question in the parking lot, because the question was one he had heard before. Not from Wren, from another girl. A girl with darker hair and a louder voice and a laugh that could fill a room like sunlight through a window. His sister, Nola. The memory came not as a flood, but as a slow leak, the kind that starts behind a wall and goes unnoticed until the damage is done. He hadn't thought about Nola deliberately in years. He had trained himself not to. The way you train yourself not to touch a hot stove, not because you forget the stove exists, but because your hand learns through repetition of pain to pull away before the thought even forms. But now in the silence of his kitchen with a stranger's child sleeping 20 feet away, the stove was right there and his hand was already on it. They had grown up in a house on the east side of San Bernardino, a house that looked fine from the outside and was a disaster from the inside, the way so many houses are. Their father was a long-haul trucker who drank when he was home and was violent when he drank, which meant that the best days were the days he was gone, and the worst days were the days he came back. Their mother had left when Garrett was 9 and Nola was 5. She left the way weather changes one morning. The sky was different, and you understood that the old sky was never coming back. Garrett, even at 9, had understood what that meant. He became the wall between his father and his sister. He took the hits. He learned to read his father's moods the way farmers read clouds, looking for the signs that predicted the storm, positioning himself accordingly. He got good at it, good enough that Nola made it to 11 without a bruise that anyone could see. But the system found them anyway. A teacher noticed something. A report was filed, and the machinery that was supposed to protect children began to move with the slow, grinding indifference of something that processes cases, not people. Garrett was 16, too old for most placements, but young enough that the system kept a file on him. Nola was 11, small for her age. Garrett in a way she hadn't been when Garrett was standing between her and the world. They were separated. Garrett ended up in a group home in Fontana. Nola was placed with a foster family in Redlands. He wrote to her. She wrote back. Her letters were careful and cheerful, the way letters are when the person writing them is trying very hard to be okay for someone else's benefit. She drew pictures of horses and houses with big windows and a son that always had a smile. Then the letters slowed. Then they stopped. He found out later, not from the system, never from the system, but from people who talked to people who knew things, that Nola had been moved. Twice, 3 times, 6 times. Each move taking her further from the girl she had been and closer to a version of herself that he wouldn't recognize when he finally saw her again. He aged out of the system at 18 and spent 2 years looking for her. He found her in a motel room in Barstow, 19 years old, 87 pounds, with track marks on her arms and eyes that looked at him without recognition for the first 5 seconds, which were the longest 5 seconds of his life. He had tried. He had carried her to his truck. He had driven her to a clinic. He had sat in the waiting room and made promises to a God he didn't believe in, offering trades he couldn't honor. Nola died 3 days later. Overdose. The official report said accidental, which was the system's way of saying nobody's fault, which was the system's way of saying everybody's fault, which was the system's way of saying nothing at all. He stood at the cremation. There was no funeral because funerals require people who cared enough to show up. And the list of people who cared about Nola Braddock at the end of her life could be written on a matchbook with room left over. Garrett stood alone in a room that smelled like chemicals and carpet cleaner, holding a small container. They handed him with a form to sign, and he signed it with a hand that did not shake because he had already decided standing in that room that shaking was a luxury he would never allow himself again. He kept the ashes. They were in a wooden box on the top shelf of his bedroom closet behind a stack of old riding gloves and a leather jacket he no longer wore. He had never opened the box again, but he knew it was there. Every morning when he reached into that closet to get dressed, he saw it on the shelf above his hand, and every morning it said the same thing to him in a voice that sounded exactly like his sister's. You were too late. You were too young. You were not enough. 22 years. That box had sat on that shelf for 22 years. And in all that time, Garrett had built his entire life around making sure he never had to hear those words again. Never getting close enough. Never letting anyone in far enough that their absence could hurt. Until a girl with a stuffed rabbit asked him a question in a parking lot. He got the tattoo a week after the cremation. Her name in script on the inside of his left forearm, where it would face him when he held the handlebars. Where he would see it every time he rode. A reminder not of what he had lost, but of what the world had taken, because he hadn't been enough to stop it. He joined the Iron Reapers the following year. Not because he wanted a family, he had learned what happened to families, because he wanted a wall, a structure thick enough to stand behind, a place where the rules were clear and the loyalty was enforced and no one asked you to feel things you had decided never to feel again. For 22 years it had worked. The wall held, the door stayed locked. He moved through the world like something carved from stone, and the name they gave him fit so well that most members had forgotten his real one. And now a 7-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit and no last name had walked across a parking lot and knocked on that door with a question so simple and so devastating that the entire structure had trembled. "Do you know anyone who wants a daughter?" He knew sitting at that kitchen table that this was Nola's question. Not because Wren was Nola. She wasn't. She was her own person, her own pain, her own stubborn, terrifying courage. But the question was the same. It was the question Nola had never gotten to ask, because by the time she needed to, there was no one left to ask it to. And the answer that the world had given to Nola through its silence, its paperwork, its endless cycle of placement and replacement, was no. No one wants you. No one is coming. No one will stop. Garrett pressed his palms flat against the kitchen table and breathed. The house was quiet except for the sound of a child sleeping in the next room. The hallway light was on. The door was open. These were the things she had asked for, and these were the things he had given, and he understood with a clarity that felt like being hit, that these small acts, the light, the door, the willingness to stay, were the entire point. He wasn't going to let it happen again. Not to this one. The next morning, Garrett called Marge Kavanaugh before the sun had fully cleared the San Bernardino Mountains. "Tell me exactly what I need to do," he said. Marge, to her credit, did not ask if he had slept on it. She did not suggest he think it over. She had known Garrett Braddock long enough to understand that when the man made a decision before dawn, the decision had been making itself for a long time and had simply waited for dawn to announce it. First, Marge said, "We find out if anyone is actually looking for this girl." What they found was worse than negligence. It was indifference so complete that it achieved a kind of perfection. Hargrove, the foster mother with the blue door, had not filed a missing person report for Wren for 3 full days after the girl walked away from her home. 3 days, 72 hours during which a 7-year-old child with no last name and no one watching her had been moving through the streets of Riverside, sleeping God knows where, eating God knows what, and not a single person in the system designed to protect her had noticed she was gone. When Mrs. Hargrove finally did file a report, and she did so only because a caseworker made a routine check-in call, not because she had noticed the empty bed or the missing shoes or the absent sound of a child in her house, the report contained 7 words describing Wren. Light brown hair, small, pink shirt, no photograph, no mention of distinguishing marks, no mention of the stuffed rabbit, which was the most important thing Wren owned, and the one detail that would have made her immediately identifiable to anyone looking. No one had gone looking. Marge Kavanaugh read the report over the phone to Garrett, and with each detail, or rather with each absence of detail, her voice got quieter and harder the way a blade gets quieter and harder as it is sharpened. 3 days, Marge said. 3 days, and the best description this woman could produce was small and pink shirt. This child could be any child. This report could be about a missing cat. What do we do with it? We use it. This is leverage, Garrett. This foster home demonstrated negligence. Documented, provable, indefensible negligence. I'm going to file a complaint with Riverside County Department of Public Social Services, and I'm going to make sure every person who should have been watching this child knows that someone is now watching them. Garrett stood in his kitchen phone to his ear and watched Wren through the doorway. She was sitting on the living room floor with her rabbit building something out of the motorcycle magazines he had stacked by the couch. She had arranged them into walls and was constructing what appeared to be a small house, carefully propping each magazine against the next, creating rooms and corridors with the focused determination of an architect working on the most important building of her career. She was building a house out of the only materials available. "There's something else," Garrett said. "Go ahead." "She told me she's been in 4 foster homes. She's 7 years old, Marge. 4 homes in 3 years. How does that happen?" Marge was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice carried something Garrett had never heard in it before. Not anger, weariness. The deep structural weariness of someone who has spent decades inside a broken system and knows exactly how it breaks. It happens because the system is designed to process volume, not people. A child who is difficult, and by difficult, I mean a child who has been so damaged by instability that she acts out or withdraws or doesn't attach easily, which is every child who has been through what this girl has been through, that child gets moved, and moved again, and again. Each move makes the next one more likely. Each new home starts the attachment process over, and each time the process starts over, the child trusts a little less and the home gives up a little sooner. It's a feedback loop. It doesn't have a villain, it just has a design flaw. And the design flaw is that nobody stays. The design flaw, Marge said, is that the system asks strangers to love children who have been taught that love is temporary. And then it acts surprised when the love turns out to be temporary. Garrett hung up and walked into the living room. Wren looked up from her magazine house. It had 4 rooms now, and she had placed the rabbit inside the largest one, propping it against a wall of glossy pages showing chrome exhaust pipes and desert highways. "That's a good house," Garrett said. "It needs a roof." He picked up a magazine from the stack, opened it to the centerfold, a full-page spread of a 1972 shovelhead in midnight blue, and laid it carefully across the top of the walls. It held. Wren looked at the completed structure and then looked at him. "It's still going to fall down," she said. "Not sadly, just accurately." "Probably," Garrett said, "but it's standing right now." Wren considered this. She reached into the magazine house and adjusted the rabbit's position, making sure it was centered, making sure it was safe. "Right now is okay," she said. Over the next 6 weeks, Garrett Braddock did something no one at the Iron Reapers clubhouse would have predicted, and something Garrett himself would not have believed possible if he had been told about it 1 month earlier. He became a person who was trying. He cleaned his house. Not in the metaphorical sense, although that was happening too in ways he couldn't see yet. He literally cleaned his house. He scrubbed the kitchen until the counters showed their original color. He organized the garage, moving the motorcycle parts to one side and creating for the first time a clear path from the door to the house that didn't require navigating around engine blocks and oil cans. He bought cleaning supplies from a store he had never entered, and the cashier, a teenage girl with braces, looked at him and then looked at the bleach and the sponges and the bottle of something called Lavender Fresh, and she processed the transaction without comment, which he appreciated. He painted the second bedroom. He chose a color called Morning Sky, which was a pale blue that the woman at the hardware store said was calming for children. He painted it himself at night after Wren had gone to sleep, because Marge had told him that Wren would need to be placed in a temporary facility while the fostering process was underway, and he wanted the room to be ready for when, not if, when she came back. He bought a bed frame, a mattress, sheets with little stars on them because the woman at the department store said girls like stars, and Garrett had no basis for disagreement. He stood in the bedding aisle holding 2 packages of sheets, one with stars, one with small purple flowers, and he realized that this was a decision he had never imagined making and had no framework for. He chose the stars because they reminded him of the sky over the Mojave on clear nights. And if he was going to give this girl a ceiling to stare at before she fell asleep, he wanted it to look like something infinite. He bought a lamp shaped like a crescent moon that gave off a warm amber light. He put a lock on the bathroom door on the inside so she could lock it, so she could have one room in the world that was hers and hers alone. He installed it himself, kneeling on the bathroom tile with a screwdriver, and when he tested it from the inside, turning the lock, hearing it click, feeling the door become something that could not be opened from the outside, he understood for the first time why Wren had asked for it. Not because she was afraid of anything specific, because she needed to know that she had the power to close a door and have it stay closed, that her boundaries were real, that her no meant no. He bought groceries that weren't beer and frozen burritos. He bought apples and bread and peanut butter and the kind of juice that comes in small boxes with straws attached. He stood in the cereal aisle for 11 minutes reading the backs of boxes, trying to determine which one a 7-year-old girl would want, and finally selected 2 because he couldn't decide and figured she should be the one to choose. And through all of this, through the painting and the purchasing and the relentless, painstaking reconstruction of a life that had been built for one and was now being rebuilt for 2, Garrett carried inside him a fear so large and so familiar that it felt less like an emotion and more like a second skeleton. The fear that he would fail her the way he had failed Nola. The fear that wanting something this much was its own form of cruelty, because the universe had shown him repeatedly and without mercy that the things you want most are the things most easily taken. But he kept going, because the alternative was stopping. And stopping meant being the door that stays closed, and he had made a promise not to Wren, not to Marge, not to anyone who could hear it, but to the memory of a girl in a motel room in Barstow who had weighed 87 pounds and had looked at him without recognition, and he had promised that memory that if he ever got another chance, any chance, even a chance that looked nothing like the one he had lost, he would not let go. Marge Kavanaugh, true to her nature, attacked the legal process with the subtlety of a battering ram and the precision of a Swiss watch. She filed the complaint against Mrs. Hargrove with Riverside County Department of Public Social Services documenting the 3-day delay, the inadequate report, the 7-word description that could have applied to any child on any street corner in any city in America. She attached notes from her own interview with Garrett, a timeline of events, and a cover letter that began with the sentence, "This office wishes to bring to the county's attention a failure of care so comprehensive that it would be unremarkable if it were not also unforgivable." Marge knew the system. She had spent 30 years inside it, first as a public defender, then as a legal aid attorney, and she understood its pressure points the way a chiropractor understands a spine. She knew which departments responded to complaints and which ones filed them in drawers that never opened again. She knew which supervisors cared and which ones had stopped caring so long ago that they couldn't remember what it felt like. And she knew that the fastest way to move a bureaucracy was not to ask nicely, but to make inaction more expensive than action. She began the application for emergency foster placement. She warned Garrett in her blunt and merciless way about what was coming. "They're going to look at everything," she told him across her cluttered desk on a Tuesday morning. "Your record, your home, your associations. They are going to see a man with 2 assault charges, a dismissed weapons charge, and a 22-year membership in a motorcycle club that law enforcement considers an organized criminal enterprise. They are going to see tattoos and a police file in a house that until 2 weeks ago looked like a mechanic's storage unit. And what are they going to miss? They're going to miss the fact that you're the only person who stopped. But that's my job, Garrett. Making them see what they're determined to miss." The home inspection was scheduled for a Thursday morning in mid-September. The inspector was a woman named Janet Pelham, a county social worker with 23 years of experience, and a face that suggested she had seen everything the system could produce and had been disappointed by most of it. She arrived at 9 a.m. in a county-issued sedan carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of professional neutrality that could have been carved from the same stone they had named Garrett after. She walked through the house with methodical precision, checking boxes on her clipboard, opening cabinets, testing smoke detectors, running water in the sinks. She noted the motorcycle parts in the garage. She noted the club memorabilia in the hallway, the photographs, the patches in frames, the shadow of a life lived in a world most people only read about in crime reports. She noted the tattoos on Garrett's arms and the record in his file. 2 assault charges from his 20s, both pled down to misdemeanors. A weapons charge from 2009, dismissed. She noted the freshly painted bedroom, the bed with its star pattern and sheets, the crescent moon lamp, the lock on the bathroom door. "Mr. Braddock," Janet said, sitting across from him at his kitchen table. The table was clean. The coffee was fresh. These were things Garrett had prepared for the way he prepared for everything, by understanding what was expected and executing it without flair. "I want to be straightforward with you. Your background presents significant obstacles to approval as a foster parent. I understand. The committee will look at your criminal history, your association with the motorcycle club, your complete lack of experience with children. They will question whether this environment is appropriate for a child, particularly a child with Ren's history of instability. I understand that too." Janet studied him. Her pen was still, her eyes were not. "Can I ask you something off the record?" Garrett nodded. "Why this girl? You've never shown interest in fostering. You don't have children of your own. There is nothing in your history that suggests this is a path you ever considered. Why now?" Garrett thought about the question. He thought about Ren sitting at the picnic table outside the clubhouse, feeding invisible jerky to a stuffed rabbit, waiting for the world to decide whether she mattered. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not at the vest, not at the tattoos, not at the reputation, and seen something that even Garrett wasn't sure existed. He thought about Nola, about the name on his arm that he saw every time he gripped the handlebars, about doors that close and don't open again. "Because she asked," Garrett said. Janet waited. She walked up to the most unlikely person she could find, and she asked. And everybody she should have been able to count on the system, the foster homes, the people who get paid to care, They all looked the other way. She asked me because I was the last door, and I don't want to be the door that stays closed. Janet wrote something on her clipboard. Her face didn't change, but the speed of her writing did. It got faster. As if something in what he had said had shifted the balance of her assessment from one column to another, and she needed to capture it before the scale tipped back. She stood, collected her things, and walked to the front door. She paused on the porch, looking out at the street, the small lawn, the neighborhood that was working class and worn, but honest in the way that places are honest when they don't pretend to be something they're not. "I'll submit my report," she said. "The committee makes the final decision." "I know." She turned and looked at him one more time. Her expression was still neutral, still professional, but something behind it had shifted the way a locked door shifts when someone tests the handle and finds that maybe, just maybe, it isn't as locked as it looks. "Good luck, Mr. Braddock," she said. And she walked to her car and she drove away, and Garrett stood on his porch in the September heat and looked at the house he had cleaned and the room he had painted and the life he was trying to build from materials the world said weren't strong enough. But he had built things before. He had built engines from parts that other people had thrown away. He had built a reputation from nothing but silence and endurance. He had built walls so solid that no one had gotten through them in 22 years. Now he was going to build a home. And if the walls came down, he would build them again, and again, and again, until they held. Because somewhere in San Bernardino, in a clean but institutional building where children slept in shared rooms and ate meals on plastic trays, a 7-year-old girl was waiting. She was holding a stuffed rabbit with one ear and one eye, and she was reading a book about animals, and she was being patient in the way that only children who have lost everything can be patient, not because they believe something good is coming, but because they have survived everything bad so far and have decided quietly, stubbornly, against all evidence to keep going. And in a 2-bedroom bungalow in Arlington Heights, a man who had spent 22 years behind the thickest walls he could build was standing on a porch looking at a street he had never really seen before because he had never had a reason to see it as anything other than a road that led away. Now it was a road that led home because the girl in the parking lot had asked a question, and the answer, the only answer that mattered, the only answer that had ever mattered, was yes. Ren was placed in a temporary group facility in San Bernardino on a Monday morning in September, and the building looked exactly like what it was, a place designed to hold children until somewhere better could be found, with the unspoken understanding that somewhere better might not exist. It was a low, rectangular structure off Waterman Avenue, painted a shade of beige that government buildings achieved through decades of indifference about color. The hallways smelled of industrial cleaner, and something underneath it that no amount of industrial cleaner could reach, something that was not dirt or decay, but sadness, the accumulated sadness of hundreds of children who had passed through these rooms on their way to somewhere else, leaving behind a residue that settled into the walls the way cigarette smoke settles into curtains. The rooms were shared, 2 beds each separated by a nightstand that was bolted to the floor. The sheets were white, the blankets were blue. The meals came on plastic trays at fixed times, and the portions were adequate in the way that things are adequate when no one involved cares whether you enjoy them. Ren was assigned a bed by the window. She placed her rabbit on the pillow, arranged the blanket so that it covered the rabbit's body, but left its face visible, and sat on the edge of the mattress with her hands in her lap, looking at the room the way a traveler looks at an airport terminal. This was not a destination. This was a place between places. Garrett was allowed to visit on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Those were the approved visitation days, and the approval had come through Marge Kavanaugh, who had made several phone calls to several people in several offices, each call slightly louder than the last, until the visits were authorized with the kind of bureaucratic speed that only occurs when someone is making a bureaucrat's life difficult enough that compliance becomes easier than resistance. He brought books. Marge had told him it would look good on the record, but that was not why he brought them. He brought them because Ren asked for them. She was reading at a level 2 years above her age, devouring stories with the hunger of someone who had discovered that books were the one thing that could not be taken away, because once a story was inside your head, no caseworker could sign a form to remove it. She liked stories about animals, wolves and horses and bears and hawks, creatures that survived in the wild, not because anyone helped them, but because they were built to endure. Garrett suspected this was not a coincidence. On his third visit, a Thursday in late September, he found her sitting cross-legged on the Bladu institutional carpet of the common room, her rabbit in her lap reading a book about a fox that lived alone in a forest and learned to trust a bird that kept returning to the same branch outside its den. "Do you think rabbits get lonely?" she asked him, not looking up from the page. Garrett sat down on the floor across from her. The floor was hard and cold and not designed for a man his size, but he sat anyway because she was on the floor and he understood that the thing she needed was not someone standing over her. "I think everything gets lonely," he said. Wren looked up. Her eyes, which were the color of creek water in October, studied his face with the precise attention of someone much older. "Even you, especially me." She considered this for a long moment, the way she considered everything thoroughly without hurry, as if the answer mattered and therefore deserved the time it took to arrive at it properly. "That's why you should get a daughter," she said with the ironclad logic of a 7-year-old who has identified a problem and located its solution. "So neither of us has to be lonely." Garrett didn't answer right away. He looked at the rabbit in her lap, at its missing eye, and its single ear, at the matted fur that showed the paths of 1,000 small fingers gripping it in the dark. He looked at the book about the fox and the bird. He looked at the room full of children who were waiting for somewhere better. "I'm working on it," he said. Wren nodded. She did not ask when. She did not ask how. She had lived long enough in a world of broken promises to know that the only ones worth trusting were the ones that showed up without announcement. If Garrett was working on it, then she would wait, and she would know it was real when it arrived, not when it was described. During those visitation weeks, Garrett noticed things about Wren that no file or report had captured. He noticed that she always sat with her back to a wall, never with her back to an open room. He noticed that she flinched when doors closed loudly, but not when people raised their voices, which told him something about the specific shape of her fear. He noticed that she never asked for seconds at meals, even when she was still hungry, because asking for more was a risk she had learned not to take. On his 4th visit, she showed him a drawing she had made. It was a house with a large front door painted blue at first, and then scribbled over with orange crayon until the blue was gone. Next to the house stood 2 figures, one very large and one very small. The large one had marks on its arms that could have been tattoos, or could have been armor, or could have been both. The small one was holding something that might have been a rabbit. "That's us," Wren said, pointing at the figures with the certainty of an artist unveiling a masterpiece. Garrett looked at the drawing for a long time. He folded it carefully and put it in his vest pocket next to the pocket where he kept his phone, which was the pocket he reached for most often, which meant it was the pocket closest to his hand, which meant the drawing would be there every time he reached for anything. "It's a good drawing," he said. "The door is orange because I don't like blue doors anymore." "Orange is a good color for a door." "It's the color of the sun when it's going down. It means the day isn't over yet." Garrett did not trust himself to respond to that. The following week, something happened at the clubhouse that tested the architecture of Garrett's dual life in a way Russell Vance's later confrontation would make explicit, but that was already even now taking shape beneath the surface. Cal Fenton was 26 years old and built like a fire hydrant, with ambitions of becoming a telephone pole. He had been a prospect for 2 years and a full member for 1, and he carried the particular arrogance of a young man who believes that toughness is a substance you can accumulate rather than a quality that is revealed only under pressure. He had a loud voice, a louder motorcycle, and opinions about everything that he shared with the enthusiasm of a man who had not yet learned that some opinions are better left as thoughts. It was a Thursday evening and several members were gathered in the clubhouse main room, which served as a bar, a meeting space, and a living room for men who preferred each other's company to solitude but would never describe it that way. The television was showing a game no one was watching. The jukebox was playing a song everyone had heard 1,000 times. The ashtrays were full. The evening was ordinary. Cal was holding court near the pool table, telling a story that was probably 50% true and 100% loud when the subject of Garrett's fostering came up. It came up the way most things come up in the clubhouse, sideways, through implication and innuendo, through the currency of gossip that flows through any closed community, the way water flows through pipes, finding every crack. "Stone's playing daddy now," Cal said, chalking his cue with the studied casualness of a man who wants to be seen being casual. "Got himself a little girl, finger painting and bedtime stories. Next thing you know, he'll be driving a minivan. A few members laughed. The laughter was cautious, the kind of laughter people produce when they're not sure which direction the joke is going to turn. I heard he's going to parenting class, Cal continued, sitting with a bunch of suburban moms learning how to change diapers. 22 years riding with the Reapers, and now he's… Cal. The voice came from the far end of the room. Hank Dunlap was standing by the bar holding a bottle of beer that he hadn't taken a sip from. His face, normally arranged in an expression of amiable disinterest, had shifted into something flatter and more careful. I'd leave that alone if I were you. Cal grinned. I'm not talking to you, Hank. I'm just saying what everybody's thinking. You're saying what you're thinking. Don't upgrade it. Cal's grin hardened. He opened his mouth to say something else, and then the door to the main room opened, and Garrett walked in. He walked in the way he always walked into rooms, slowly without looking at anyone in particular, registering everything. He went to the bar. He picked up a bottle of water. He opened it, drank, and then turned and looked at Cal Fenton with the same expression he gave everything else in the world, which was no expression at all. But his eyes were different. Cal saw it. Everyone in the room saw it. Say it to my face, Cal. 6 words, delivered in a voice that was not raised, not lowered, not inflected in any way. Just 6 words placed into the air, like stones placed onto a scale. Cal Fenton did not say it to his face. Cal Fenton did not say much of anything for the rest of the evening. He played pool. He drank his beer. He left early, and when he passed Garrett on the way out, he gave a nod that was half apology and half the recognition that some men are not to be tested, not because they will hurt you, but because they have something to protect, and a man protecting something is the most dangerous thing in any room. After Cal left, Hank sat down next to Garrett at the bar. Kid's got a mouth. Kid's got a point, Garrett said. Half the club thinks I've lost it. Half the club doesn't have the imagination to think past next weekend. The other half is watching you do something they wish they had the guts to do. Which half are you? Hank took a long pull from his beer and set it down with a precision that suggested the question deserved a considered answer. I'm the half that was there the day she walked into the parking lot. I saw her face. I saw yours. And I've known you 16 years, Garrett. I've seen you take hits that would have put other men in the ground. I've never seen you flinch. But when that girl asked you that question, something moved. Something behind the stone. And whatever that was, I think it's the realest thing I've ever seen come out of you. He finished his beer. So I'm whatever half believes in that. Big Arlo Stegner was the other half. Or perhaps he was his own half entirely, because Big Arlo defied categorization in every sense. He was 6'6", 310 pounds, with a beard that could have housed a small ecosystem, and hands that looked like they had been designed for a creature 1 evolutionary stage larger than a human being. His voice was a gentle bass that emerged from his massive frame, like a cello note from a concert hall, incongruous and beautiful. Arlo had been with the Reapers for 14 years. He worked part-time as a welder, full-time as a presence, and in his spare time, he built furniture from reclaimed wood, which he gave away to anyone who needed it, because he believed that a man who could build things had an obligation to build things for people who could not. He showed up at Garrett's house on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks before the hearing, driving a flatbed truck and with something large and covered in a moving blanket in the bed. "What is that?" Garrett asked, standing in his driveway in a t-shirt and jeans, holding the coffee he had just made. "Bookshelf," Arlo said, pulling back the blanket to reveal a 4-shelf bookcase made of reclaimed pine, sanded smooth and stained, a honey color that caught the morning light and held it. The joints were tight. The surfaces were level. It was the kind of furniture that belonged in a catalog, not in the bed of a flatbed truck, driven by a man who looked like he could pull the truck himself. "For the girl," Arlo added, as if this required explanation. "Every kid needs a bookshelf. My old man built me one when I was her age. Only good thing he ever did." He carried it into the house alone, positioned it in Wren's bedroom against the wall opposite the window, and stood back to evaluate it with the critical eye of a craftsman assessing his own work. "Needs books," he said. "She's got books. She needs more." Arlo pulled a paper bag from his truck. Inside were 6 children's books, all about animals, all purchased. Garrett noted from the independent bookstore on Main Street, rather than from a chain, which meant Arlo had gone to the kind of store he would normally never enter, and had conversations with the kind of people he would normally never speak to, and had done so because a girl he had never met needed books for a shelf he had built her. You didn't have to do this, Arlo. I know I didn't have to. That's the point. Arlo left without ceremony the way he always left, which was the way large quiet men leave by simply not being there anymore, as if they had been absorbed back into the landscape. Garrett placed the books on the shelf. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at the room. The pale blue walls, the star-patterned sheets, the crescent moon lamp, the bookshelf full of stories about animals that survived, the bathroom with the lock on the inside. It looked like a room where a child could live. It looked like a room where a child could be safe. It looked, for the first time since Garrett had bought this house 12 years ago, like a room that meant something. But a room, however carefully prepared, was not a guarantee. It was a promise made in paint and pine, and promises Garrett knew were only as strong as the system that allowed them to be kept. Meanwhile, the machinery of the foster system continued its slow grinding advance. Marge Kavanaugh had filed the application for Garrett to become a licensed foster parent, and the application had entered the pipeline, and the pipeline was long and lined with paperwork and populated by people who processed forms for a living and had long ago stopped seeing the people behind the forms. But Marge did not rely on the pipeline. Marge did not trust pipelines. Marge trusted leverage. She had compiled a file on Mrs. Hargrove's foster home that was 12 pages long and devastating in its precision. The 3-day delay in reporting, the 7-word description, the absence of a photograph, but also, and this was the part that made Marge's eyes narrow, the way a hawk's eyes narrow when it spots movement in the grass below, the discovery that Mrs. Hargrove had been receiving foster care payments for Wren for the full 3 days after the girl had walked away. 3 days of payment for a child who was not in the home. 3 days of state money flowing into a household for the care of a child who was sleeping God knows where. That's not negligence, Marge told Garrett over the phone. That's fraud. Small-scale fraud, but fraud nonetheless, and the county does not enjoy learning that its money is being spent on children who are not where they are supposed to be. She used this information the way a locksmith uses a pick. Carefully, precisely, applying pressure at exactly the right points until the mechanism turned. The complaint against Mrs. Hargrove triggered a review of her foster care license. The review triggered an investigation. The investigation triggered a suspension. And the suspension meant that the 6 other children in Mrs. Hargrove's home, 6 children whose names Garrett did not know, but whose faces he imagined every time he closed his eyes, were redistributed into the system, which was exactly the kind of upheaval that drew attention from county supervisors, which was exactly the kind of attention that Marge wanted drawn. I want them watching, she told Garrett. I want every supervisor in Riverside County aware that this case exists. Because when your application comes up for review, I want it to come up in a room full of people who already know that the alternative, leaving this child in the system that failed her, is not an acceptable alternative. While Marge worked the legal angles, Garrett faced a different kind of pressure, one he had not anticipated and could not file a complaint about. It came from Russell Vance. Russell was 58 years old, the president of the Iron Reapers Charter, and he had held that position for 11 years through a combination of political skill, physical authority, and a voice that could make reasonable requests sound like threats, and actual threats sound like the weather forecast. He was a large man, though not as large as Garrett, with iron gray hair, pulled back in a ponytail, and a handlebar mustache that he maintained with the dedication other men give to their lawns. He found Garrett in the clubhouse garage on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks after Wren had been placed in the San Bernardino facility. The garage smelled of oil and metal and the particular brand of solvent that the club bought in bulk. Garrett was rebuilding a carburetor, which was the kind of work that his hands did when his mind needed to be somewhere else. Stoner Russell said, pulling up a metal stool and sitting down with the careful authority of a man who wants you to know that the sitting is a choice, not a surrender. We need to talk about your situation. Garrett didn't look up from the carburetor. Which situation? The one where you're trying to adopt a kid. Foster, for now. For now, right. Russell crossed his arms. His vest creaked. His eyes, which were the color of old denim, settled on Garrett with the patient steadiness of someone who has had difficult conversations before and knows that the important thing is not to blink. You know I respect you. Everyone here respects you. 22 years, and you've never given this club a reason to question your loyalty. But, but this thing you're doing, it brings eyes. Social workers coming to your house, inspections, background checks, county people looking at where you live, who you associate with what's in your garage. And what's in your garage stone sometimes includes things that county people should not be looking at. Garrett set down the wrench. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at Russell for the first time. Are you telling me to stop? I'm telling you that the club has concerns. I'm telling you that when a member invites the government into his life, the government doesn't always stay in the room it was invited into. I'm telling you that there are people in this charter who have things to lose and they're not comfortable with the idea that your humanitarian project might be what puts law enforcement on our doorstep. The garage was quiet. Somewhere in the clubhouse, someone dropped a bottle and someone else laughed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the particular frequency of lights that have been buzzing for years and will continue buzzing long after the last person turns them off. Russell, Garrett said, I hear you. And I'm asking you to hear me. This girl has been through 4 homes in 3 years. She walked into our parking lot because she had nowhere else to go. She asked me for help because I was the last person standing between her and nothing. That's a sad story, I mean that. But sad stories don't change the fact that this club operates in a certain way, and that way depends on keeping certain doors closed. I'm not opening any doors that lead to the club. You don't get to control where the doors lead once they're open. That's the problem. They looked at each other across the workbench, across 22 years of shared history, across the invisible line that separates a request from an ultimatum. I'm not going to ask you to choose, Russell said. Not yet. But I need you to understand that if this goes sideways, if your foster thing brings heat to this charter, I will ask. And you know what that means. Garrett knew what it meant. It meant turning in his patch. It meant walking away from the only structure that had held his life together since Nola died. It meant losing the wall. I understand, Garrett said. Russell nodded, stood, and walked out of the garage without another word. The stool stayed where he'd left it, empty and metal and cold, like a question that hadn't been answered yet. The first hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday in late September. Marge Kavanaugh prepared for it the way a general prepares for a campaign, meticulously, aggressively, and with the assumption that the opposition would not play fair. She gathered character references from 11 people. 4 of them were members of the Iron Reapers, which Marge had debated including, and ultimately decided to keep, because removing them would look like shame, and shame was the last thing she wanted in that room. The others included the owner of the auto parts store where Garrett had been a regular customer for 15 years, a neighbor on Emerson Street who had watched Garrett shovel her driveway after a rare winter storm without being asked, and Brenda Rowe, the instructor of the parenting education course that Garrett had already begun attending. The course was held at a community center in downtown Riverside on Tuesday and Thursday evenings in a room with fluorescent lights and motivational posters in the particular smell of all community centers everywhere, which is the smell of good intentions and linoleum. Garrett walked in the first night to a room full of couples in their 30s, accountants and teachers and office managers who looked at him the way gazelles look at something large moving through tall grass, carefully, from a distance, with an eye toward the exit. He sat in the back row and took notes in a small spiral notebook with a pencil that looked comically small in his hand. He wrote slowly and carefully the way people write when they believe that the information might save someone's life. Brenda Rowe, the instructor, was a cheerful woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain and a cardigan that she wore regardless of the temperature. She asked everyone to introduce themselves and share why they were there. Garrett waited until his turn came. He stood because sitting felt wrong, and his full height produced a brief, rippling silence in the room. My name is Garrett, he said. I'm here because a little girl asked me a question I couldn't say no to. Nobody laughed. A woman in the second row pressed her hand to her chest. A man near the window nodded once the way men nod when they recognize something real. Brenda Rose smiled in a way that suggested she had heard 1,000 reasons for being in this room, and this one had just made the top 5. Garrett completed the 40 hours. He learned about developmental stages and attachment theory, and the difference between punishment and discipline, and the 17 different ways a child can say, "I'm scared," without using the word scared. He learned that children who have been in the foster system often hoard food because hunger is a memory that lives in the body, not just the mind. He learned that nightmares about doors, closing about doors, locking, about being on the wrong side of a door, are among the most common nightmares for children who have experienced multiple placements. He thought of Wren, the hallway light, the open door. She had already told him what she was afraid of. He just hadn't had the vocabulary for it yet. The hearing was held in a conference room on the fourth floor of the Riverside County Administrative Building. The room had a long table, 5 chairs on one side, 2 chairs on the other, and a window that overlooked the parking lot with the same indifference that the building showed toward everything that happened inside it. The committee had 5 members. 3 of them looked at Garrett the way most people looked at Garrett, with the cautious distance reserved for things that might bite. They saw the vest which he had chosen to wear because Marge told him to, because Marge believed that hiding who you were was a worse strategy than making people confront who you were. They saw the tattoos. They saw the beard. They saw the file in front of them, which contained his record and his history and the sum total of every mistake the system had documented. One of them, a retired teacher named Leonard Fisk, had round glasses and a bow tie, and the demeanor of a man who had spent 40 years asking students to sit down and be quiet. He asked Garrett directly whether he intended to maintain his membership in the motorcycle club. "I intend to maintain my membership in everything that makes me who I am," Garrett said. "The club is part of that. So is this. You don't see a conflict. I see a girl who needs a home. I don't see how the bike I ride changes that." The fourth committee member was a pediatrician named Dr. Warren Hobbs, who said little but took notes in a handwriting so small that it suggested a man who was accustomed to fitting large thoughts into small spaces. The fifth was Diane Overstreet. She had been mostly silent through the proceedings, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and the stillness of someone who listens more than she speaks and draws conclusions that other people arrive at later. She leaned forward. "Mr. Braddock," she said, "what will you do if this doesn't go your way?" Garrett looked at her. He looked at the committee. He looked at the window that overlooked the parking lot where his truck was parked, and he thought about the girl in San Bernardino who was reading about foxes and feeding invisible food to a stuffed rabbit, and he thought about the wooden box on the top shelf of his closet. "I'll appeal," he said, "and if that doesn't work, I'll appeal again. I'm not the kind of man who quits because the road gets rough." Then came Dale Crenshaw. Crenshaw was the county's attorney assigned to the case, a lean man in his 40s with a narrow face and the particular energy of someone who views his job not as service but as territory. He had a folder of his own, and he opened it with the efficiency of someone who has opened many folders in many hearings and has learned that the contents are usually enough to end the conversation. "If the committee will permit," Crenshaw said, adjusting his glasses, "I'd like to enter into the record a summary of Mr. Braddock's known associations." Marge's hand tightened around her pen. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. But expecting a punch and absorbing one are different experiences. Crenshaw presented his case with the methodical pleasure of a man dismantling something he does not like. He cited the club's classification by law enforcement. He referenced specific incidents or arrests of other members' investigations that had touched the charter, the general reputation that the Iron Reapers carried in Riverside, like a weather system that never quite cleared. He did not accuse Garrett of anything specific because there was nothing specific to accuse him of, but he built an atmosphere of implications so thick that the air in the room seemed to change color. The county's position, Crenshaw concluded, folding his hands on the table, is that placing a minor child, particularly a child with a documented history of instability and trauma, in a home environment that includes active association with an organization known for criminal activity does not meet the standard of care required by the state of California. The room was quiet. Marge stood. She was 5 feet 2 inches tall, and she filled the room the way a lit match fills a dark closet. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "The county's position," Marge said, "is interesting. Let me offer a different position. The position of the child." She opened her own folder. She placed documents on the table with the precision of a card dealer. "Mrs. Hargrove did not report this child missing for 72 hours. 72 hours. In that time, a 7-year-old girl walked the streets of Riverside alone without food, without shelter, without a single adult in the system looking for her. The report, when it was finally filed, contained 7 words of description. No photograph, no search effort. She paused. This child has been in 4 foster homes in 3 years. 4 placements, 4 failures. The system that Mr. Crenshaw represents has had 4 opportunities to get it right for this girl, and it has failed every single time. Not occasionally, not partially, completely. She placed another document on the table. This is the home inspection report from Janet Pelham, who has 23 years of experience with Riverside County. Ms. Pelham describes Mr. Braddock's home as adequate and improving. She notes his completion of required training. She notes his consistent visitation with the child. And she notes, and I quote from her supplementary report, that in her professional opinion, Mr. Braddock demonstrates genuine and sustained intent to provide a stable environment. Marge looked at the committee, one by one, the way a teacher looks at students who she suspects have not done the reading. You can look at this man and see his tattoos and his record and his motorcycle club, or you can look at this girl's file and see a system that has failed her at every turn, and a man who is the first person in her entire life to say, "I will not let you fall." The committee's choice is simple. You can trust the system that created this crisis, or you can trust the man who is trying to fix it. She sat down. The committee deliberated for 90 minutes. They asked additional questions. They reviewed documents. They spoke in voices too low for the hallway to hear where Garrett stood with his hands in his pockets and his back against the wall and his eyes on the pattern of the floor tiles, counting them. Because counting was something to do with a mind that was trying very hard not to imagine every possible version of the next 5 minutes. Hank Dunlap stood beside him. Hank had come to the hearing in a button-down shirt that he had clearly purchased for the occasion because the collar still had the fold marks from the packaging. He didn't say anything. He just stood there because sometimes the most useful thing a friend can do is occupy the space next to you so that you are not occupying it alone. The decision came at 4:17 in the afternoon. Provisional approval, 6-month trial period, supervised check-ins every 2 weeks. One condition: complete the 40-hour parenting education course within the first 90 days. The words were read by the committee chair, a woman whose name Garrett would not remember, because the only thing his brain was processing in that moment was the word approval, and the fact that it existed in the same sentence as his name. In the hallway afterward, Diane Overstreet found him. She was shorter than she had appeared behind the committee table, and up close her eyes carried the particular brightness of someone who has just participated in a decision she believes in. "Mr. Braddock," she said, "for what it's worth, the committee wasn't unanimous. But the majority agreed that the child's documented experience in the system outweighed the concerns about your background." "Which way did you vote?" Garrett asked. He didn't know why he asked. It didn't matter anymore. "I voted in your favor," Diane said. "Both times it came up." Garrett nodded. He started to turn away. "Mr. Braddock," he stopped. "Crenshaw isn't going to let this go. He'll be watching for any reason to petition for revocation during the trial period. Any incident involving the club, any police contact, any disruption in the child's school performance or welfare, he'll use it." "I understand. I'm telling you because I don't want to see that girl back in the system. I've read her file, 4 placements in 3 years. That file tells a story, and the story is that the system keeps giving her to people who give up. Don't be the 5th. She walked away down the corridor, her heels clicking on the tile with a rhythm that sounded to Garrett's ears like a clock counting forward instead of running out. Hank drove him to the nearest bar, not the clubhouse, not any place affiliated with the Reapers, but a quiet place on a side street in downtown Riverside, where the bartender was old and the lighting was dim, and nobody cared who you were as long as you paid your tab. They sat at the bar. Hank ordered 2 beers. Garrett ordered a water. Hank looked at the water, looked at Garrett, and then ordered himself a second beer to compensate for what he considered a cosmic imbalance. "You're not drinking," Hank said. "No." "Since when?" "Since I decided that a kid shouldn't come home to a house that smells like beer." Hank was quiet for a moment. He turned his bottle in his hands, studying the label as if it contained information he hadn't noticed in the previous several thousand bottles. "She changed you," Hank said. "It wasn't a question. She asked me a question." The answer changed me. Same thing. No, Garrett said. It's not. She didn't ask me to change. She asked if anyone wanted her. The changing is what I had to do to make the answer true. Hank considered this with the gravity of a man who was slightly drunk and entirely sincere. You know, Hank said, I've known you 16 years. I've seen you face down situations that would make most men run. I've never been worried about you. Not once, Ishomanso. But I'm worried now. Why, Manandam? Because you've got something to lose. And you've never had that before. And men who have something to lose make different decisions than men who don't. Sometimes better, sometimes worse. Always more desperate. Is that a warning? It's an observation. From a friend who is drinking your share of the beer and who would like you to know that whatever happens next, I'm in your corner. Even if your corner has a bookshelf in it and smells like lavender cleaning solution. Garrett almost smiled. Almost. The muscles twitched in the vicinity of the expression, but didn't quite commit the way muscles twitch in a man who has spent so long not smiling that the machinery needs oiling. Thank you, Hank. Don't thank me. Buy me another beer. The next morning, Marge called Garrett at 6:42, which meant either very good news or very bad news, because Marge Kavanaugh did not make social calls before 7. Provisional approval, she said. 6 months. Supervised. One condition. Garrett sat on the edge of his bed, phone pressed to his ear, and didn't speak for 10 full seconds. Garrett, you there? I'm here. Well, say something. What kind of course? Marge laughed. It was the first time Garrett had ever heard her laugh, and it sounded like a chain being pulled through a pipe, rough and industrial and unexpectedly warm. The kind where they teach you how to pack a school lunch and handle a temper tantrum. You'll survive. Garrett hung up. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time in the quiet of a house that was about to stop being quiet, and he looked at the bedroom door, which was open, and the hallway light, which was on, and the second bedroom, which was painted the color of morning sky and had a bed with star-patterned sheets and a crescent moon lamp on the nightstand. And for the first time since he could remember, since before the Iron Reapers, since before the years of solitude, since before the motel room in Barstow, and the weight of a sister who did not recognize him, Garrett Braddock felt something that he could only describe as the opposite of losing. It wasn't joy exactly. It was closer to relief. The relief of a man who has been holding his breath underwater and has finally, after what felt like forever, broken the surface. He exhaled, and then he stood up and he walked to the kitchen, and he made coffee, and he sat at the table where he had sat the night Wren slept in his house for the first time, and he began to make a list. Things to buy before she gets here. The list was long, and for once that felt like a good thing. He drove to San Bernardino that afternoon. It was not a visitation day. Tuesday and Thursday were the approved days, and this was a Friday, and under normal circumstances, the facility would have turned him away with the polite firmness of a system that valued its schedules more than its people. But Marge had made a call. Marge always made a call. Garrett was led to the common room by an orderly who looked at his vest and his tattoos and his size and decided that the safest course of action was to say nothing and walk quickly. The common room was empty except for 2 children playing a board game in the corner, and Wren, who was sitting by the window in the chair she always sat in, reading a book about a wolf pack that crossed a frozen river in winter. She looked up when he entered. She did not smile. She did not jump up. She studied his face the way she always studied faces, carefully reading the expression, the way a sailor reads the sky looking for signs of what was coming. You look different, she said. Different how? Less heavy. Garrett sat down across from her. The institutional chair groaned under his weight like a creature being asked to perform beyond its capabilities. I have news, he said. Wren closed her book. She placed it on her lap, aligned the edges with the precision of someone who treats books as sacred objects, and folded her hands on top of it. She waited. The committee approved my application. Provisional. That means there's a trial period. 6 months. People will come to the house to check on things. But it means you can come home. He had not planned to say that word. Home. It had arrived in the sentence without permission, the way certain words do when they have been waiting a long time to be spoken and finally see their opening. Wren did not react the way a child in a movie would react. She did not leap into his arms or cry tears of joy or say anything that could be set to music. She sat very still and something passed behind her eyes, a calculation. An assessment, the rapid processing of a girl who had been told good things before and had learned that good things frequently came with expiration dates. For how long, she asked. For as long as you want it, Garrett said. And then because he knew that those words were easy to say and that she had no reason to trust easy words, he added, I know you've heard promises before. I know they didn't hold. I'm not going to promise you that everything will be perfect. I'm going to promise you that I will be there. Every morning, every night, every time you need the hallway light on and the door open. That's the promise. Wren looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her stuffed rabbit, which had been sitting on the windowsill beside her like a companion, keeping watch, and she held it against her chest. Can I bring my books? You can bring everything you own. I don't own much. Then it won't take long to pack. Something shifted in Wren's face. Not a smile, not exactly. Something deeper than a smile. Something that lived underneath the expressions a face makes and only surfaces when the machinery of hope long dormant begins to turn again. Okay, she said, just that. Okay, one word, two syllables. The smallest possible container for the largest possible feeling. And Garrett Braddock, who had built walls for 22 years and had never let anyone see what was behind them, felt those walls tremble. Not fall, not yet, but tremble the way a structure trembles when it realizes that the thing pressing against it from the other side is not a threat, but a hand reaching through. The day Garrett brought Wren home was October 3rd. The temperature had dropped into the low 70s, and the San Bernardino Mountains were visible against a sky so blue it looked artificial, like someone had painted it that morning and hadn't bothered to add clouds because the blue was enough. Garrett drove his truck, a gray Ford F-150, that he used for occasions when a motorcycle wasn't practical, which until now had been limited to hauling engine parts and picking up lumber. He had installed a booster seat the night before after watching a 12-minute instructional video 3 times, because the first 2 viewings had convinced him that the straps were designed by someone who had never met a human child, and the 3rd viewing had revealed that the problem was not the straps but his hands, which were too large for the buckles and too accustomed to gripping wrenches and handlebars to manage the fine motor work of child safety clasps. He had gotten it right, eventually. The seat was secure. Wren sat in the back, her stuffed rabbit arranged on the seat beside her, buckled into its own section of the strap, as if it too were a passenger with rights and a destination. She looked out the window with an expression that Garrett would later describe to Hank as like she was memorizing everything in case it got taken away. The strip malls, the palm trees, the taco stands, the intersections, every detail cataloged and stored by a girl who had learned that landscape was temporary, and the only reliable map was the one you carried in your head. When they pulled into the driveway on Emerson Street, Wren didn't move right away. She looked at the house through the windshield. The freshly painted front door orange, because Garrett had remembered what she said about orange being the color of the sun going down, the color that meant the day wasn't over yet. The small lawn mowed for the first time in anyone's memory. The pot of marigolds that Marge Kavanaugh had insisted he buy, because in her words, a home needs something living in front of it, and you can't kill a marigold unless you actively try. Is this your house? Wren asked. It's our house, Garrett said. And then because the words felt too big and too fragile for the air between them, he added, for as long as you want it. Wren unbuckled herself, climbed out of the truck, and stood on the driveway holding her rabbit by its single ear. She looked at the orange door. She looked at the marigolds. She looked at the sky, which was doing the thing that California skies do in October, turning the light gold and amber, and making everything underneath it look like it belongs in a photograph someone would frame. She walked to the front door and stopped. Can I open it? She asked. It's your door. She reached up. She had to reach because the handle was higher than her shoulder, and turned the knob, and the door opened, and she stepped inside. She stood in the hallway and looked at the house the way she had looked at it the first time, but different now. Different because the last time she was a visitor, and this time the house had her name on it in ways that paperwork hadn't yet caught up to, but that the walls already knew. She walked to her bedroom. She stood in the doorway and looked at the pale blue walls, the bed with its star pattern and sheets, the crescent moon lamp, the bookshelf made of reclaimed pine with 6 books about animals standing in a row. She looked at the bathroom door and the lock on the inside that she could turn whenever she needed the world to be smaller and safer. She placed her rabbit on the pillow. She arranged it carefully, propping it against the headboard so that its one remaining eye faced the door, keeping watch. Then she turned to Garrett, who was standing behind her in the hallway, filling it the way he filled all spaces, and she said, "It smells like paint. I painted it a few weeks ago." "What color was it before?" "White. Just white. I like blue better." "Me too." That was the extent of the ceremony. There was no ribbon cutting, no tearful embrace, no swelling orchestra or slow-motion close-up. There was a girl in a bedroom that had been painted for her and a man in a hallway who had painted it, and between them the unspoken understanding that this was the beginning of something that neither of them had a map for, and that the only way forward was to walk it together and figure out the terrain as they went. The first month was chaos wrapped in uncertainty, tied with a ribbon of exhaustion, and served on a plate of learning experiences that Garrett had not known existed. He learned about morning routines. Specifically, he learned that a 7-year-old girl's morning routine bears no resemblance to the morning routine of a 44-year-old man who had spent the last 15 years waking up, making coffee, and leaving. Ren's mornings involved decisions about clothing that Garrett had not known were decisions. They involved hair that needed to be brushed and braided, a skill he was still developing with the clumsy determination of a man who understood torque and gear ratios, but was just now grasping the physics of a French braid. They involved breakfast, which needed to be something other than black coffee, and a lunch that needed to be packed, and a backpack that needed to contain specific items in specific pockets. He drove her to school each morning in the F-150, which looked absurd in the drop-off line alongside minivans and sedans, driven by parents who looked nothing like Garrett Braddock. The first week, the other parents stared. The second week, they stopped staring and started whispering. The third week, a woman in a yoga outfit approached him in the parking lot and asked if he was Ren's father. "Yes," he said. "Oh." The woman processed this. Her eyes traveled from his face to his tattoos, to his vest, to his boots, and back to his face. "It's just, we haven't seen you at any of the PTA meetings." "When are they?" "Tuesdays at 6. "I'll be there." He was there. He sat in the back of the school cafeteria on a folding chair that was comically small for his frame, surrounded by parents who carried tote bags and reusable water bottles, and the particular confidence of people who had been doing this since their children were born. They discussed bake sales and field trips in the playground equipment fund, and whether the school's aftercare program was adequately staffed. Garrett contributed nothing to these conversations, but he listened and he was present, and presence, he was learning, was its own form of participation. After the second meeting, a man named Craig, polo shirt, khaki shorts, the unmistakable energy of someone who coached youth soccer, sat down next to him. "You're Ren's dad, right?" "That's right. My daughter Sophie talks about her all the time. Says Ren's the best reader in the class." "She reads a lot." "Sophie wants to have Ren over for a play date. If that's, something you'd be open to." Garrett looked at Craig, who was trying very hard to appear casual and was not entirely succeeding, because there is a specific kind of discomfort that polite suburban men feel when they are talking to a man who looks like Garrett Braddock, and that discomfort manifests as an overproduction of friendliness. "I'll ask Ren," Garrett said. He asked Ren. Ren said yes with a speed that had surprised him, and 3 days later, he dropped her off at Craig's house in a neighborhood of manicured lawns and basketball hoops, in the sound of children playing, and he sat in his truck in the driveway for 15 minutes before driving away. Because leaving her somewhere, anywhere, even a bright house where a man named Craig and a girl named Sophie were waiting with juice boxes and board games, felt like letting go of a rope he had only just learned to hold. She came home that evening talking more than he had ever heard her talk. About Sophie's room, which had a canopy bed. About Sophie's cat, which was orange and named Marmalade. About the book they had read together about a girl who raised wolves. "Can we get a cat?" Ren asked. "We'll talk about it." "That means no." "That means we'll talk about it." She smiled. It was not the first time she had smiled in his presence, but it was the first time the smile had arrived without caution, without the careful hedging of a girl who had learned that happiness was a thing that could be revoked. It was just a smile, simple and full, and aimed at him like a flashlight in the dark. Parent-teacher conferences were a revelation. Ren's teacher, a young woman named Ms. Calloway, had kind eyes, and a classroom decorated with construction paper and encouragement. And she told Garrett that Wren was performing above grade level in reading and at grade level in mathematics, and that she was quiet in class but engaged, the kind of student who listened more than she spoke, but whose hand went up when she had something to say that mattered. She's adjusting well, Miss Calloway said, sitting across from Garrett at a desk that was designed for 8-year-olds and made him feel like a giant visiting a dollhouse. She's made a friend, a girl named Sophie. They read together at recess. She reads at recess. Not always. Sometimes they play, but mostly they read. Wren brings books from home. Ms. Calloway paused. She told me about the bookshelf in her room. She's very proud of it. Garrett felt the thing in his chest move again, the thing that had been pressing against the wall since the parking lot. It was still pressing. It was always pressing. And the wall, which had held for 22 years, was developing the kind of cracks that let light through. He learned that Wren wouldn't eat tomatoes, but would eat tomato sauce, a distinction she defended with the ferocity of a constitutional scholar arguing a landmark case. He learned that she needed the hallway light on when she slept, and that this was not negotiable, not a preference, but a requirement as fundamental as air. He learned that she had nightmares about doors, specifically about doors closing and locking, with her on the wrong side, about the sound of a deadbolt turning, about the particular quality of silence that exists on the side of a door where you are alone. He learned to leave every door in the house open, every single one, even the closets, even the pantry, even the front door during the day propped open with a brick, because the sight of an open door told Wren something that words could not. You can leave whenever you want. You can always get out. You are not trapped here. The supervised check-ins began immediately. Janet Pelham handled most of them. She came every 2 weeks, clipboard in hand, and walked through the house with the methodical precision of someone conducting an audit of a very specific kind. She spoke with Wren alone in her bedroom with the door open. She spoke with Garrett alone in the kitchen with the same door open. She checked the refrigerator, the medicine cabinet, the general condition of the home. She made her notes in handwriting that was small and exact and gave nothing away. After the second visit, Garrett asked her directly, "How am I doing?" Janet looked at him over her clipboard. Her expression was the same expression she always wore, the professional neutrality of a woman who had learned that showing emotion in this job was a liability. "You're doing what you're supposed to be doing," she said. "That's a start." After the fourth visit in late November, she told him something he didn't expect. "She's thriving," Janet said, standing on the front porch as the late afternoon sun turned the marigolds golden. "Her reading scores are up. Her teacher reports increased participation. She's making friends. Her weight has stabilized." Janet paused, and in that pause, something in her demeanor shifted like a gear engaging that had been idle. "I've been doing this job for 23 years, Mr. Braddock. I've placed children in beautiful homes with perfect-looking families, homes with 2 incomes and advanced degrees, and rooms that look like they came from a magazine. And I've watched those placements fall apart because the house was right, but the people were wrong, or the people were right, but the commitment was temporary, or everyone meant well, but no one was willing to do the hard thing, which is to stay when staying gets difficult." She looked at him directly. "What matters isn't the house. It's whether the child feels safe, and that girl in there feels safe." Garrett nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. "For what it's worth," Janet added, stepping off the porch, "I've changed my mind about you, and I don't change my mind easily." She walked to her car, and Garrett stood on the porch and watched her drive away, and he thought about doors, about how some doors close and never open, and some doors open and never close, and the difference between the two is not the door, but the person standing beside it. Winter came to Riverside the way it always does, not with snow, but with cooler mornings, shorter days, and the smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys in the older neighborhoods. The mountains turned a darker shade of brown. The sunsets arrived earlier each evening, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples that Wren liked to watch from the front porch, sitting in a folding chair next to Garrett, who sat in his own folding chair, which creaked under his weight with the resigned patience of furniture that has accepted its fate. They developed a routine. Mornings were for school and work. Afternoons were for homework and reading. Evenings were for dinner. Garrett's repertoire had expanded from frozen burritos to approximately 8 meals, all of which Wren rated on a scale of okay to really good, with spaghetti holding steady at really good. and a chicken dish he attempted once holding firmly at, "Please don't make that again." Bedtime was for the hallway light and the open door and the rabbit on the pillow and the slow, even breathing that told Garrett each night that the girl in the next room was still there, still safe, still his. On Saturdays, Hank Dunlap came over. He had appointed himself Wren's unofficial uncle with the cheerful authority of a man who had never been an uncle before and was making up the rules as he went. He taught her to play poker with M&M's Oasis chips and lost spectacularly, and often because Wren, it turned out, had an instinct for reading faces that would have made her a formidable player at any table in any casino in the world. She could tell when Hank was bluffing from across the room. She could not, however, tell when Garrett was bluffing because Garrett's face never changed, which she found both frustrating and hilarious. "You don't have any tells," she told Garrett one Saturday evening, surrounded by a pile of M&Ms that represented Hank's complete financial ruin. "I know," Garrett said. "That's not fair. Life's not fair, but the M&Ms are yours." Then in late January, Russell Vance came back, not to the house, to the clubhouse on a Tuesday night when Garrett was there for what would turn out to be one of his last meetings as a member. The meeting was routine club business, finances, upcoming rides, a dispute about territory that had been simmering for months and would continue simmering because that was the nature of territory disputes. But after the meeting, when most of the members had dispersed to the bar or the parking lot or the long ride home through streets that smelled like night jasmine and exhaust, Russell caught Garrett's arm in the hallway. "We need to talk, outside." They stood in the side yard, the same yard where Wren had eaten beef jerky 5 months earlier. The picnic table was still there, scarred by cigarettes and pocket knives and the weight of 1,000 elbows. The chain-link fence was still Miriam. The razor wire was still there, catching the streetlight in small, sharp glints. Everything was the same except for the two men and the weight between them, which had been growing since August and had now become too heavy for the space to contain. "Riverside PD has been running surveillance on the clubhouse," Russell said. His voice was low-measured, the voice of a man delivering information he has already processed and made decisions about the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis he has already confirmed with the lab. "3 weeks now. Unmarked cars on Magnolia, plainclothes in the liquor store across the street. They're not even trying to be subtle, which means they want us to know." Garrett said nothing. He waited. Waiting was what he had always done. But the waiting felt different now because the thing he was waiting to hear was something he had been expecting since August, the way you expect a storm you have been watching build on the horizon. "My contacts say it started because of an inquiry, a government inquiry, related to a foster care case, related to you." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. "Crenshaw," Garrett said, "doesn't matter who started it. What matters is that it's happening, and it's happening because of your situation. The boys are nervous, Garrett. I've got members with outstanding warrants, members with product in their garages, members whose livelihoods, whose freedom depends on law enforcement not sitting outside our front door with binoculars and the kind of patience that only government funding can buy." Russell pulled a cigarette from his vest pocket, lit it, and exhaled smoke into the cold January air, where it hung like a question before dissolving. "I told you this might happen. I told you I'd ask you to choose if it came to this. It's come to this, brother." Garrett looked at the yard, at the fence, at the building he had walked into 22 years ago as a prospect with nothing to lose, and a wound so deep it had become the foundation of everything he built afterward. He had given this club his loyalty, his strength, his silence, and his youth. He had given it the years between 22 and 44, which are the years a man is strongest, and the club had given him back the only thing he had ever asked for, a structure thick enough to stand behind. And now the structure was asking him to step away. "You're asking me to turn in my patch. I'm asking you to protect this charter, the same way you've always protected this charter. Sometimes protection means standing in front. Sometimes it means stepping aside so the rest can keep standing. I protected this charter for 22 years, Russell. I stood in front of this charter when standing in front meant taking hits that weren't mine. I know you did, and I know what I'm asking, and I know it's not fair, but fair has never been a word that applied to the world we live in, and you know that better than most." They looked at each other across the darkness, across 22 years of shared roads, and shared silences, and the particular bond that forms between men who have trusted each other with things that cannot be spoken about in daylight. I need a week, Garrett said. You've got until Friday. It was not a week, but Garrett didn't argue. There was no argument to make that would change what was happening. The machinery was in motion, and the only question left was which direction he would step. He drove home that night and sat on the front porch in his folding chair, in the dark in the cold January air, and he looked at the street he had lived on for 12 years without ever really seeing it. The houses with their porch lights. The sidewalk where Mrs. Patterson walked her dog every morning. The street light on the corner that flickered sometimes and made the shadows move. Inside the house, Wren was sleeping. The hallway light was on. The door was open. Garrett reached into his vest and touched the patch above his heart. The Iron Reaper's insignia, the skull with the piston eyes, 22 years of his life sewn into leather carried against his chest. He thought about Nola, about the box on the top shelf of his closet, about the girl in the motel room in Barstow who had weighed 87 pounds. He thought about Wren, about the rabbit with one ear, about the orange door in the blue room and the star pattern in sheets. He thought about what Hank had said in the bar. You've got something to lose. Yes, he did. And for the first time in his life, what he had to lose was worth more than what he was being asked to give up. On Friday, he went to the clubhouse. He rode the Road King one last time down Magnolia Avenue, past the liquor store, and the bus stop, and the vacant lot where kids played basketball in the summer, and he pulled into the parking lot that was full of Harleys, the way it was always full of Harleys, chrome and leather, and the smell of exhaust and oil that had been the perfume of his adult life. He walked past the fence, past the cinder block walls, past the photographs in the hallway group shots from runs and rallies, men standing in front of their bikes with their arms crossed and their faces arranged in the particular expression that men in motorcycle clubs believe looks tough, but actually looks like men who are trying very hard not to show what they feel. He found Russell in the main room. Hank was there too, sitting at the bar, and Big Arlo was there taking up his customary 2 stools, and several other members were scattered around the room in the poses of men who know something is about to happen and are pretending not to. Garrett reached inside his vest. He found the patch, the Iron Reaper's insignia, the skull with the piston eyes, the rocker underneath that read Riverside, and he pulled it free. Thread by thread, the sound of threads separating from leather is a small sound, barely audible, but in that room it was the loudest thing anyone had ever heard. He placed the patch on the bar. The room was very quiet. The jukebox for once was not playing. The television was off. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator behind the bar and the distant thrum of traffic on Magnolia Avenue, the sound of the world continuing outside while something ended inside. Thank you, Garrett said, for 22 years, for giving me a place to stand when I didn't have one. Russell looked at the patch on the bar. He reached out and placed his hand on it, not to pick it up, but to acknowledge it the way you place your hand on a headstone. You're a good man, Stone. My name is Garrett. He turned toward the door. Hank stood up from his stool. Garrett, he stopped. I'm not turning in mine, Hank said, but I want you to know you're still my brother. Patch or no patch, that doesn't change. Big Arlo from his 2 stools nodded. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His nod carried the weight of a man whose body and heart were both enormous and both were saying the same thing. Garrett looked at them, at Hank with his broken muffler laugh and his button-down shirt with fold marks, at Arlo with his gentle bass voice and his hands that built bookshelves for children he'd never met. And he understood that the club was a structure, but these men were something else. These men were friends. And friendship, unlike membership, does not come with patches that can be removed. I know, Garrett said. He walked out. The parking lot was bright with January sun, the kind of thin winter light that makes everything look sharp and clear, like a photograph taken with perfect focus. His Road King was waiting where he had left it, chrome catching the light, engine cooling with the soft ticking sounds that motorcycles make when they are resting. He straddled it, turned the key, felt the engine rumble through his body the way it always had, vibrating through the frame and the seat and up through his spine, and he rode home. The motorcycle was his. The road was his. The man he had always been underneath the patch, and the name on the wall was his. Everything else he had given away, and it was the lightest he had felt in 22 years. Hank came by the house the following Saturday with a 6-pack of root beer, A deliberate choice that made Garrett shake his head, and they sat on the front porch in the folding chairs, and Wren sat between them on the step, and they played cards until the sun went down. Nothing was different. Everything was different. The three of them were not a club. They were not an organization. They were just people sitting in the last light of a winter afternoon playing cards, drinking root beer, and being in the simplest and most important sense of the word together. It was a Tuesday evening in February. Garrett was in the kitchen making spaghetti. The sauce was bubbling on the stove, filling the house with the smell of tomatoes and garlic, and the particular warmth that cooking produces not just in temperature, but in atmosphere, the sense that someone cares enough to turn raw things into something nourishing. Wren was at the kitchen table doing homework. Her pencil moved across the worksheet with the focused intensity she brought to everything, the same intensity with which she read books and evaluated faces and decided moment by moment whether the world was keeping its promises. "Garrett," she said without looking up. "Yeah." "At school today, Tyler Brennan said that you're not my real dad." Garrett turned the burner down. He leaned against the counter and crossed his arms, not because he was angry, but because he needed something to do with his hands, while the rest of him figured out how to handle this. "What did you say to Tyler Brennan?" "I said he doesn't know anything." She paused. Her pencil stopped moving. "But then I thought about it, and I wanted to ask you." "Ask me what?" Wren put her pencil down and looked at him. Her hair was brushed now. Garrett had learned a French braid from a video tutorial, and though his first attempts had looked like something assembled during an earthquake, he had gotten reasonably competent. Her sneakers had laces in both shoes. Her shirt was clean. She looked by every measure like a child who was cared for. "Are you my real dad?" Garrett pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. The chair protested audibly the way all furniture protested under Garrett Braddock. "I didn't make you," he said. "That's biology. And no, that part isn't me." He paused. "But I chose you. Or maybe you chose me. I'm still not entirely sure what happened in that parking lot. What I know is this: I wake up every morning and the first thing I think about is whether you're okay. I go to sleep every night and the last thing I check is whether your hallway light is on. I learned to braid hair and pack lunches and sit in tiny chairs at parent-teacher conferences. And I've done every single one of those things because you are my daughter. Not because a piece of paper says so, because I say so." Wren was quiet for a long moment. The spaghetti sauce bubbled softly on the stove. The kitchen light cast warm shadows on the walls. The house, which had been silent for 15 years before Wren arrived, was full of the small sounds of living, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the breathing of two people who had found each other in the least likely place on earth. Then Wren got up. She walked around the table. She climbed onto Garrett's lap, something she had never done before. She was heavier than he expected, or maybe he was just not used to holding anything this carefully. She pressed her face against his chest, against the cotton and the heartbeat underneath, and she wrapped her small arms around as much of him as she could reach, which was not very much, but it was enough. "That's what I told Tyler Brennan," she said. Garrett put his arms around her and held on. He didn't care that the spaghetti sauce was starting to bubble over. He didn't care that the homework wasn't finished. He didn't care about the hearing or the committee or the background checks or any of the 1,000 pieces of paper that the world required before it would acknowledge what a 7-year-old girl in a parking lot had already known from the first moment she looked at him and saw not a biker, not a criminal, not a man made of stone, but a door that might open. The 6-month review hearing was scheduled for March. Marge Kavanaugh prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, with the assumption that the world would be hostile and the determination to be more hostile in return. She compiled school records, medical checkups, reports from Janet Pelham, statements from Wren's teacher, and a letter from Brenda Rose certifying that Garrett had completed all 40 hours of the parenting education course. In this part, Marge read aloud with visible satisfaction. "Demonstrated exceptional engagement and a genuine commitment to providing a nurturing environment." Dale Crenshaw was there again at the hearing table with his folder and his glasses and his particular energy. But his folder was thinner this time and his arguments were shorter, and the committee listened with the distracted politeness of people who have already made up their minds and are waiting for the formalities to conclude. The committee reviewed the reports. They asked their questions. They deliberated for less than an hour. The provisional status was extended to a full foster care placement with a clear pathway to adoption. Diane Overstreet found Garrett in the hallway afterward. She was smiling, which he had never seen her do. "For what it's worth, Mr. Braddock, I voted for you both times. Sometimes the best families are the ones nobody saw coming." The adoption was finalized on a warm Saturday in June, nearly a year after Wren had walked across a parking lot full of Harley-Davidsons and asked a question that changed the trajectory of two lives. A year, 12 months, 365 days of mornings and evenings and meals and bedtimes and nightmares and laughter and silence and the slow, patient work of building trust from materials that the world had tried its best to destroy. The courtroom was so small and bright, with wood paneling and an American flag, in the particular atmosphere of a room where important things happen quietly, where lives are officially rearranged by the stroke of a pen, and the words of a judge who has seen enough of the world to know that the law at its best is just a way of catching up to what the heart already knows. Marge Kavanaugh was there in a blazer she had bought for the occasion, her fire hydrant frame contained in dark blue fabric that looked like it was being worn under protest. She had fought for this day with everything she had: her legal knowledge, her bulldog tenacity, her network of contacts and favors, and the particular currency of a woman who had spent 30 years in the system and knew exactly where all the levers were and how hard to pull them. She sat in the front row with her hands folded, her chin up, and her eyes bright with something she would have denied if anyone had asked. Hank Dunlap was there wearing a tie for what he claimed was the third time in his life, and he kept adjusting it with the uncomfortable frequency of a man who believes neckwear is a form of punishment invented by someone who had never ridden a motorcycle. Big Arlo was there, taking up approximately 2 seats in the gallery, his enormous hands folded in his lap, with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his size. He had worn a clean shirt. It was the cleanest shirt anyone had ever seen on Big Arlo, and the fact that he had ironed it was evidence of the kind of care that large, quiet men show when something matters deeply to them. Janet Pelham was there in the back row, her clipboard nowhere in sight for the first time in Garrett's memory. She sat with her hands in her lap and her face carrying an expression that on anyone else Garrett would have called emotional. On Janet, it was simply the absence of professional neutrality, which was its own kind of revelation. Brenda Rowe from the parenting class had come. So had Craig, the soccer coaching father of Sophie, who had become something like a friend over the months of playdates and school events, and the particular bond that forms between parents who are both trying their best in a world that doesn't come with instructions. The judge was an older man with kind eyes behind silver-rimmed glasses and a voice that carried the particular gravity of someone who has delivered 10,000 decisions and understands that each one matters to the people standing in front of him, that each one is not a case number, but a life. "Do you understand what is happening today?" the judge asked Wren, who was standing beside Garrett in the space between the tables where lawyers sit and the bench where the judge presides, a space that in most courtrooms feels like no man's land, but today felt like the exact center of everything. "Yes, sir," Wren said. She was wearing a dress that Marge had helped her pick out, white with small blue flowers, and her hair was in a French braid that Garrett had done that morning with hands that had finally, after months of practice, learned to be gentle with small things. "And is this what you want?" "Yes, sir." She looked up at Garrett, who was standing beside her in a button-down shirt that Marge had made him by, his beard trimmed to a length that qualified as civilized, his hands clasped in front of him in the posture of a man who is trying very hard to be still when everything inside him is moving. "I picked him," she said. The courtroom was very quiet. "In the parking lot. I saw everybody else walk by. He was the only one who stopped." The judge looked at Wren. He looked at Garrett. He looked at the file in front of him, which contained a year's worth of documents and reports and legal arguments. And then he looked back at the girl and the man, and what he saw was simpler than anything the file could contain. "The court approves the adoption of Wren, now Wren Braddock, by Garrett Braddock." Marge made a sound that might have been a cough, or might have been something else. Hank turned away and spent a suspicious amount of time adjusting his tie. Big Arlo's enormous hands folded in his lap tightened around each other. Janet Pelham in the back row wrote nothing on any clipboard because some things are not meant to be documented. Some things are meant to be felt. Outside the courthouse, the June sun hit the sidewalk with the full confidence of a Southern California summer. The palm trees cast shadows that stretched across the parking lot like long, lazy fingers. The sky was the kind of blue that makes you understand why people live here despite the traffic and the fires and the cost of everything. Wren held Garrett's hand, her small fingers wrapped around two of his the way they always did because his hand was too large for her to hold entirely, and she had learned to hold what she could and trust that the rest would be there. Garrett, she said, yeah, kid, can we get ice cream? We can get whatever you want. They walked to the truck and Garrett opened the back door so Wren could climb into her booster seat. She buckled herself in, arranged her stuffed rabbit on the seat beside her, and looked out the window at the courthouse, at the palm trees, at the world that had finally, after 7 years of closing doors and moving sidewalks and plastic trays and shared rooms and nights spent wondering if anyone would ever stop walking past Maid Room. Hank Dunlap pulled up alongside the truck on his Harley engine, rumbling in the afternoon heat, sunlight flashing off the chrome. "Stone!" he shouted over the noise and then caught himself and grinned. "Garrett, the boys are meeting at 4. You coming?" Garrett looked at Hank. He looked at the Harley, at the road that led to the clubhouse on Magnolia Avenue, where he had spent 22 years of his life. Then he looked in the rearview mirror at Wren, who was whispering something to her rabbit, her face turned toward the window, her eyes wide and full of the particular light that fills a child's eyes when the world for once is behaving the way it should. "Not today," Garrett said. "I've got plans with my daughter." He turned the key. The engine started. He pulled out of the parking lot and onto the street and drove toward the ice cream shop on University Avenue, where a man with tattoos on his arms and a name on his forearm that he no longer needed to carry as a wound, because the wound had become something else, something that still ached, but ached the way old injuries ache when the weather changes. A reminder of what happened, but no longer a definition of who he was, and a girl holding a one-eared rabbit with a single eye sat at a plastic table in the sun and ate ice cream. Wren ordered strawberry, 2 scoops. She ate it with the focused dedication she brought to everything, catching the drips with her tongue before they reached the cone, managing the melting with the strategic precision of a general managing a campaign on multiple fronts. The rabbit sat on the table beside her, propped against the napkin dispenser, its one eye facing the street as if keeping watch. Garrett ordered vanilla, 1 scoop. He ate it slowly, watching the street, watching the people who walked past, watching the afternoon light do the thing it does in Southern California in June, which is to make everything look golden and permanent, like a photograph that has already been taken and framed and hung on a wall somewhere in the future. A woman walked past with a stroller and glanced at them, at the man with the beard and the ink and the seats, at the girl with the rabbit and the ice cream and the French braid, and she smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a polite smile. A real one. The kind of smile that people produce when they see something that makes sense to them on a level they couldn't explain if you asked. "Garrett," Wren said, working on the second scoop. "Yeah. What happens now?" He looked at her face, which was smeared with strawberry ice cream, in a way that she would have found undignified if she had been aware of it. At her eyes, which were the color of creek water in October, and which had seen in 7 years more closed doors and broken promises than most people see in a lifetime. At her hands, small and sticky, and holding a cone in one and a rabbit in the other, the 2 most important things in her world. "Now," Garrett said, "we go home, and tomorrow we wake up and do it again, and the day after that, and the day after that." For how long? For as long as there are days. Wren considered this. She took a bite of her cone, and the crunch was loud in the afternoon quiet. "That's a lot of days," she said. "That's the idea." She finished her ice cream. She wiped her hands on a napkin with the thorough attention of someone who has learned that cleanliness is a form of respect for yourself and for the people who care about you. She picked up her rabbit, tucked it under her arm, and slid off the plastic chair. "Ready?" Garrett asked. "Ready." They walked to the truck, side by side, the man and the girl, their shadows stretching long and connected across the warm sidewalk. And no one who saw them, not the woman with the stroller, not the teenager behind the ice cream counter, not the old man reading a newspaper on the bench by the door, thought twice about it. Because the truth, when you finally see it, is simple. Family doesn't look like anything in particular. It looks like whoever shows up.